Howdy y'all, welcome back. Thank you for being here. If you haven't already, you can check out part 1. We're diving into every star fort that exists or once existed in the United States of America. This is part 2. Enjoy. This sprawling fortress is known as Fort Jefferson in the Dry Tortugas National Park. Not only is this one of the most remote star forts in all of America, situated roughly 68 miles off the coast of Key West, but Fort Jefferson is actually the largest brick masonry structure in the entire Western Hemisphere, being constructed of over 16 million bricks, encompassing an area of over 16 acres. The history here is equally fascinating. According to the current narrative, Fort Jefferson began as a concept by Commodore David Porter to build a fort to protect the Caribbean from piracy. Inspecting the Dry Tortugas Islands, Porter was unimpressed, and in the year 1825 he reported that the landscape was uninhabitable. However, a lighthouse, which is now known as the Garden Key Light, was constructed by the year 1826 against the wishes of Porter. The lighthouse was apparently whitewashed upon completion and made to look significantly older. A second survey under Commodore John Rogers in the vessel known as Florida reported the Dry Tortugas as a perfect location for a fort, due in part to the natural inner and outer harbors. John Rogers presented this idea by 1829. However, it wasn't until the year 1845 when United States Army Captain Robert E. Lee, the same Robert E. Lee who would go on to lead the Confederate Army, recommended to Thomas Blake that a fort be constructed in the Dry Tortugas region. Construction first began on the fort surrounding the lighthouse, which the fort was said to have been built around. The existing Garden Key Lighthouse and the lighthouse keeper's cottage were contained within the walls of the Star Fort. Construction was said to have began in 1846. However, the operation was said to have taken many decades, and we're told after a series of shifts in architectural designs, the Star Fort Jefferson was only about halfway complete by the year 1860. However, the fort was also said to have been almost completed by 1861 as it was being utilized during the Civil War. We have evidence that slave labor was used and the fort was still under some sort of construction by the year 1863. By 1876, a new lighthouse was constructed from, quote, industrial strength metal, and by 1877, the original lighthouse, which the entire Fort Jefferson was built to protect, was actually torn down. The Star Fort Jefferson is 6-sided, with 2 sides of 325 feet in length and the other 4 sides of roughly 477 feet in length. We're told all 16 million bricks were the responsibility of the Pensacola firm known as Rayford and Abercrombie. To provide ample fresh water, the entire fort is fitted with intricate cisterns. A further seawall was also completed in 1872. However, by 1874, we're told frequent hurricanes made Fort Jefferson nearly inhospitable. By 1889, it was abandoned and handed over to the Marine Hospital Service. By 1895, it was said to have been stripped by vandals and laid empty. Fort Jefferson then saw a brief resurgence in the Spanish-American War of 1898 before being given to the Navy in 1902, abandoned again by 1906, and by the year 1910, Fort Jefferson was considered a haunt for local fishermen and was almost entirely overgrown. Unknown to the public around this time, Fort Jefferson was actually a secret base for naval seaplane communications during World War I, but remained a ruin until roughly 1934. In 1935, Franklin Roosevelt designated Fort Jefferson as a national monument, and at this time, it was meticulously restored. Fort Jefferson, the Star Fort, still stands today. Next, we will look at the Star Fort, known as Fort Zachary Taylor, again in Florida, on the southern tip of Key West. Fort Zachary Taylor was built in 1845 and now serves as a National Historic Landmark. The Bastion Fort is considered to be Civil War era, however, it actually predates the war by well over a decade. Thomas Island was selected as the location to extend the United States' new series of star forts in the South following the War of 1812. We're told this fort was designed by Simon Bernard and Joseph G. Cotton in the year 1836. However, it took until 1845 for the construction to begin, with the fort then opening officially in November of 1850, being named Fort Zachary Taylor after the president who had passed away in office just a few months earlier. We're told between Fort Zachary Taylor and the mentioned earlier Fort Jefferson, the United States Army Corps of Engineers brought well over 400 enslaved people to the Florida Keys, who would then remain there after these two forts were completed. Fort Zachary Taylor was absolutely massive, with the walls being 50 feet tall, over 5 feet thick, and the three seaward walls, known as curtains, each measured roughly 495 feet in length. The fort also included a 1,200-foot causeway, which connected the fort to the dry land. Fort Zachary Taylor also had massive cisterns around the fort for providing fresh water. Amazingly, the same company that produced over 16 million bricks for Fort Jefferson are also said to have provided millions of bricks for Fort Zachary Taylor at the exact same time, begging the question, how large truly was the firm of Rayford and Abercrombie to be able to produce well over 20 million bricks? By 1898, the massive 50-foot tall fort was reduced in size and made to stand only 2 stories tall. We're told Star Fort Zachary Taylor was used throughout the Spanish-American War, both World Wars, and even used during the Cuban Missile Crisis, before being shut down shortly thereafter. Remarkably, by 1968, Fort Zachary Taylor was excavated and discovered within its ruins to house the nation's largest collection of lost Civil War-era technology. It was all buried under layers of mud in long-forgotten portions of this star fort. The fort was then meticulously cleared, added to the National Register of Historic Places in 1971, and made a National Historic Landmark in 1973. The Fort Zachary Taylor still stands today and is used mainly as a museum and also a fort for Civil War reenactments. The next star fort to be discovered within the United States is the long-lost fortress of Fort Lee in Salem, Massachusetts. I say long-lost because this location today is almost entirely overgrown, and yet, if the current narrative is to be believed, Star Fort Lee has remained relatively untouched for the last 200 years. We're told Fort Lee is situated on the Salem Neck in Massachusetts. The Salem Neck has an oral history of being fortified since pre-European arrival to the area. However, Fort Lee is the first documented fort on this location. Fort Lee was an irregular-shaped, five-sided star fort, built mostly from earthworks and light usage of bricks. Interestingly, we're told the original earthworks making out the star fort still survive today. However, we also have an original building, a masonry stone powder magazine, which dates back to at least 1776. The entire Star Fort Lee was apparently rebuilt less than 2 decades after being first constructed and was heavily repaired during the 1790s. We're told from Salem records that Fort Lee has not been officially occupied, cleared, or built on top of since the 1790s, last serving in battle during the War of 1812 and last being garrisoned officially in the Spanish-American War of the late 1800s. However, Fort Lee was federalized the whole way back in 1867 and then transferred from federal control to the city of Salem in 1922. Attempts were made to fully clear the Star Fort Lee in 1976, but these attempts failed, and the fort is again overgrown and nearly unrecognizable. The Bastion Fort Lee was added to the National Register of Historic Places in 1994, and the original earthworks, if you can find them beneath all of the rubble and debris, as well as the stone magazine, still stand today. The next fort you may be familiar with already. I have visited this fort, and many of you may have seen this fort or traversed this beautiful castle if you've played the game Fallout 4. This is, of course, Fort Independence, located on Castle Island in Boston, Massachusetts. Castle Island was actually an island off the coast of Boston until 1928, when it was connected to the mainland, making it a peninsula. The location of Fort Independence is one of the oldest continuously occupied communities in America and dates back hundreds of years before the island was connected to the mainland. The original structure built here, known as the castle, dates back to 1634. Remarkably, from the rise of this 1634 castle came at least 2 enlargements of the castle. The castle was first known as Castle William and became a massive star fort, which was eventually abandoned by the British during the United States War for Independence. The United States then seized the star fort almost immediately, renaming it Fort Independence in 1799. However, this star fort was previously the known hideaway for British troops for many years and many conflicts, and this star fort was involved directly in both the Stamp Act crisis of 1765 and the Boston Massacre of 1770. In 1785, the government of Massachusetts designated the Star Fort as a prison, in which capacity it served Massachusetts until 1805. Today, the Star Fort you see is considered to be the third fort built on top of the foundations of the previous 2. This Star Fort was built beginning in 1833 as part of the larger third system of United States fortifications, seemingly indicating the inheriting and repurposing process had long been happening in this neck of the woods. We're told the current stone building is quite literally built around earlier red brick, which was revealed in 20th century excavations. Following the Civil War, Fort Independence gradually fell out of use, as its importance was reduced by more modern, non-star forts. Somehow, simpler forts were replacing these lavish ones. Frederick Law Olmsted, notorious landscape architect who had his hand in a slew of questionable aspects of the world's fairs, was brought into Boston to help reshape the city. His plan was to connect Castle Island to the mainland. Castle Island and Fort Independence were further developed through the late 1800s, serving the armed forces of America through the Second World War. In 1962, Castle Island and Fort Independence were permanently deeded to the state of Massachusetts. A folk story claims that a duel took place at Fort Independence on Christmas Day of 1817. Here, Robert Massey held a sword duel against Gustavus Drane, where Massey, who was said to have been beloved by his troops, was fatally wounded. Struck with grief and in a frenzy, this myth states that Drane was then walled in one of the walls of Fort Independence. One of the troops who served at Fort Independence just so happened to be Edgar Allan Poe, who was inspired by the story of Drane and Massey to write the Cask of Amontillado. Fort Independence, in a much restored fashion, still stands today. Fort Jackson in Plaquemines Parish, Louisiana, is an absolutely epic star fort that was said to have been built between the years 1822 and 1832, according to the current narrative. This multiple layered star fort was originally one of the most intricately designed star forts ever built on American soil. Fort Jackson is roughly 70 miles south of New Orleans and sits just across the Mississippi River from an even earlier star fort known as Fort St. Philip. It appears both star forts were constructed on important scouting locations for indigenous people, sites of previous burial mounds constructed by the mound builders of the Mississippi River. Fort St. Philip dates to 1746 and was supposedly built by the Spanish. Fort St. Philip defended New Orleans through the Civil War and was used as a tanning factory during the early 1900s. Fort Jackson, on the other hand, sitting just outside of Triumph, Louisiana, is the much more robust and substantial Bastion Fortress. Originally, Fort Jackson was built under the advice of Andrew Jackson, and by the Civil War, Fort Jackson was Confederate controlled. Nearly 2 weeks is what it took for the Battle of Fort Jackson and Fort St. Philip, which began in 1862, that led to the fall of both of these star forts, and then they came under Union control. Under the Union, the fortresses were quickly rebuilt and reinforced. Fort Jackson remained in regular federal use until well after World War I, when it became a military training center. Fort Jackson was declared a national monument in 1960. However, it was also said to have been filled with mud at this time, and the history was largely lost. And I quote, "The fort area had become a jungle of mud-filled tunnels infested with snakes and flooded with water. The history was lost," end quote. Fort Jackson was heavily renovated after this discovery and added to the National Register of Historic Places in 1967. This fort still stands today as a museum operated by the Plaquemines Parish Commission Council. This is one of the largest star forts in Louisiana. This right here is known as Miller's Battery, and this was actually added to Fort Jackson in 1898 when many countries around the world had decided to stop utilizing bastion or store fortresses, we can see that the United States of America, for whatever reason, was still employing these store forts at the turn of the century. But I digress. I believe I'm going to wrap up this second video on the store forts of the United States right there. I'm going to chime out, but stay tuned for part 3 and check out part 1 if you have not already. We have over 24 more store forts that we will be diving into, and I can't wait to share all of this information, all of the oldest photographs with you. So leave your comments and thoughts down below, and we will talk again very soon.